Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie. And I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week, we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Michigan, when a successful, career-driven mother of two just mysteriously vanished around Valentine's Day of 2007. A huge search quickly ensued to find out what on earth had happened to her. Had she chosen to just disappear and go off the radar, or had something far more sinister happened here? Had she been the victim of foul play? All hands were on deck to try and locate her. Missing posters were created, the police and her family were appealing to the public for information. However, as the days passed by, suspicion started to fall on one person in her life, and one person only, as being responsible for her sudden disappearance. A person who had been trying desperately hard to portray themselves as a victim in this case, as someone who was just as distraught as everyone else that she was missing. But what the police would soon realise was that these were crocodile tears. This individual was in fact hiding a dark secret. They knew far more about this disappearance and, as it would turn out, homicide than they were letting on. Join me as we delve into the devastating case of Tara Lynn Grant. But quickly, before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as domestic violence and abuse, and the theme of suicide is also mentioned. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back approaching 18 years now to February of 2007 in Macomb County, which is obviously a county in the state of Michigan in the US. And this is Tara Lynn Grant. She was a 34-year-old woman who lived in Macomb County with her family. Tara was born Tara Lynn Distramp on the 28th of June 1972 to her parents Gerald and Mary Distramp, and she was one of two children. She had a sister named Alicia, and Tara was born in Michigan, so as far as I'm aware, she had lived there her whole life, and it would appear as though she had a very normal, happy upbringing for the most part. As a child, Tara was said to have been a big animal lover, particularly horses. She loved horses. She actually had her own horse, but she would raise and look after other animals too for the state fairs. She even won a Grand Champion award for one of her hogs that she had raised. She was also a very active young girl, very sporty. She would always take part in her school sports team. She would play basketball and run track. She was on the cheerleading squad and she played clarinet in the school band. Tara just seemed to be a very determined and hardworking girl growing up, and this was something that she carried right into her adulthood. After she graduated from high school, she became a student at the Michigan State University, where she studied business administration, and she later earned a bachelor's degree in the subject. And following her graduation in 1994, she got herself an incredible job working for a big construction and engineering firm called Washington Group International. And by the time this case occurred in 2007, she'd actually been with the company for about 12 years, I believe. She was working as an operations manager for the company, and she was incredibly good at her job. A highly intelligent young woman was Tara Lynn Grant. But we have jumped ahead slightly there, back to when Tara was a university student, and that was when she met the man that would go on to become her husband. She met Stephen Grant. Stephen was a couple of years older than Tara. He was around 37 at the time that this case took place, and obviously she was 34. The two met at a party back in Tara's uni days, and they quickly became very good friends, and that was all that they were for a while. Tara wasn't really interested in anything more than that initially. They were just good friends, and Stephen was a very good friend to Tara. According to one source, when Tara's grandfather sadly passed away, Stephen was there for her, even surprising her by attending the funeral just so that he could support her. And it appears as though it was following this when their friendship started to develop into something more. They started dating, they fell in love, and eventually Stephen asked Tara to marry him. I actually read that he proposed to Tara at this art museum in Detroit, because that was another thing about Tara. She absolutely adored art, and so yeah, he decided to pop the question in one of her favourite places, an art gallery. I believe they married around 1996-1997 time, making Tara Lynn Distramp Tara Lynn Grant, and they went on to have two children together. They had a daughter named Lindsay, who was born in the year 2000, making her around 6 years old by the time this case occurred. And then a couple of years later, in 2003, they had a son who they named Ian. So he was around 4 years old, and Ian seemed to complete their little family of 4. And Lindsay and Ian were lucky enough to have a very privileged upbringing. Their parents were able to send them to a private school thanks to their mother Tara and her very well-paid job. As I said, she worked as an operations manager for Washington Group International, and this job paid very, very well. Apparently she had a 6-figure salary, so they could afford to live in a nice house in Macomb County and again send their kids to private school. And Tara and Stephen Grant actually kind of defied stereotypes in a way, because whilst Tara went off and worked and was the breadwinner of the family, Stephen was a stay-at-home dad. Apparently he literally referred to himself as the mum of the house because he was, you know, the main caretaker of the kids, making their dinners and picking them up from school, whilst Tara worked hard to bring in the money and financially provide. And this dynamic seemed to work really well for them at first. Stephen enjoyed being a stay-at-home dad, Tara enjoyed being a working mum, working full-time. I mean, it was hard for her, don't get me wrong, because part of her job as an operations manager actually meant working away a lot. So the corporation that she worked for, Washington Group International, had firms all over the world, clues in the name. And so Tara constantly travelled to different firms in different countries and different states as part of her job. One week she could be in London, the next she could be in Idaho or Puerto Rico. She would travel to whichever firm she was going to on the Monday, catch a plane back to Michigan on the Friday, and then she would spend the weekends with her husband Stephen and their kids before she would be off again. Which, like I said, was difficult for her. It was difficult for her to be away from her 2 children for most of the week. But at the same time, she loved it. She was such a career-driven woman. She loved her job, she loved to travel, and she was happy in the knowledge that while she worked, her kids were being looked after by her husband Stephen. And not just Stephen. Tara knew that looking after the kids 24/7 on his own might be a lot for Stephen, especially because he did still want to work sometimes here and there too. Apparently he did soccer coaching on the side, and he also worked in his father's tool and machinery shop occasionally. And so to make it a bit easier for her husband, Tara hired an au pair, a nanny who would live with the family and just help out with the children. The couple had actually had a few different au pairs stay with them over the years, but by early 2007, the au pair who was working for them was named Verena. She was just 19 years old and she was originally from Germany, but she travelled over to the US to find work, and that was the life of the Grant family, I suppose. That was the dynamic, their structure, and it seemed to work really well for them. And to an outsider's perspective, they seemed like a very normal, hard-working family. Stephen and Tara Grant seemed to be a normal, happy married couple living in Michigan, which is the reason why it came as such a shock when in February of 2007, tragedy struck this seemingly normal American family when 34-year-old Tara Lynn Grant just suddenly disappeared without a trace. The date was the 14th of February 2007, Valentine's Day, and that day the Macomb County Sheriff's Office were contacted by a man who wanted to report his wife of more than a decade as missing. This man was, of course, Stephen Grant. It was Tara that was missing. In fact, she'd actually been missing for about 5 days by this point. Stephen's account was that the Friday evening before this, so the 9th of February 2007, his wife Tara had returned home from work. That week she had actually been working in an office in Puerto Rico, and she flew back to Michigan that Friday night to spend the weekend with her family. Only she wouldn't be spending the whole weekend with them this time. As I mentioned earlier, usually Tara would arrive home on the Friday and she would travel to wherever she was working that next week on the Monday, so she would have the entire weekend with her husband and kids. But this particular weekend was different. When Tara got home on the 9th, she informed her husband Stephen that unfortunately she would have to travel back to the Puerto Rico office on the Sunday instead of the Monday, because there was this big meeting that Tara would have to attend early Monday morning. And Stephen told the police when he reported his wife as missing that this did cause an argument between them. He was angry that Tara had agreed to travel back on the Sunday because he didn't feel like it was fair. It wasn't fair on him as her husband, it wasn't fair on their kids. Yes, it was her job and she was the provider, but also he almost felt like Tara wasn't putting their family first, and it seemed as though he had been feeling this way for a while. Like I said, to an outsider's outsider's perspective, Stephen and Tara Grant seemed like a happy, stable, married couple, I guess. But behind closed doors, cracks in their marriage were starting to emerge. Arguments were often breaking out, many of which did centre around Tara's work. Stephen didn't feel as though Tara was prioritising their family because her working away so much was taking its toll. And so yeah, when she returned home that Friday night and she told him that she would be going back to Puerto Rico on the Sunday, he was furious and he started shouting at her. Following their argument, Stephen told the police that he heard Tara take a phone call. She was speaking to someone on the phone. He didn't know who, but he heard her say to this person, quote, "I'll meet you at the end of the driveway." She then packed a bag, opened the front door and left, and Stephen saw her getting into a dark coloured car which then drove away. He had no idea where she was going and he told officers that that was the last time he had seen her. That Friday night she left after they argued and never returned. But of course it had been 5 whole days since then. As we know, he didn't report her as missing until the 14th. So the police asked him why had it taken so long for him to make this report, and he basically said that the reason was because this wasn't totally out of character for Tara. According to one report, he claimed that his wife had done this before. If they'd had an argument, she would often walk out, leave for a few days, but she would always come back, and so he was just waiting for her to eventually return, but this time she never did, and he had been trying to call her mobile phone to find out where she was, but she never picked up. So he was leaving her voicemails, pleading with her to get in contact, saying that she owed him and their children an explanation, but radio silence. Tara never got in touch. And so yeah, 5 days after he last saw her, Stephen Grant finally decided that it was time to ask the police for their help in locating his wife. And because it had been 5 days since Tara Grant was last seen, the police didn't really hesitate here. They jumped into action straight away, and a missing persons investigation was swiftly launched. Searches for Tara were quickly underway. Her family, her sister Alicia, created missing posters. The police were taking statements from the people in Tara's life. So for example, as well as taking a statement from Stephen, they also spoke with her work colleagues. They spoke with their live-in nanny Verena, the 19-year-old au pair from Germany, who obviously helped Stephen to look after the kids, and she claimed that she was out of the house on the night that Tara was last seen. She was out with friends, which was confirmed. And this case was very quickly in the news. It hit the headlines. The police were appealing to the public for information regarding Tara's whereabouts, and Stephen Grant himself was even contacting different media outlets, different news stations, trying to get his wife's case out there as much as possible. Over the next few weeks, he did several TV appeals, just begging anyone who knew anything about his wife's disappearance to come forward, and he was distraught in these appeals. He would get very, very upset and emotional. He seemed genuinely just heartbroken that his wife was missing. He was so worried about her. However, the detectives were not so convinced, not convinced by Stephen Grant's performance, shall we say, on the news. Whilst he appeared to be this devastated and concerned husband during the TV appeals, the police did soon have their suspicions that perhaps Stephen knew more about his wife's disappearance than he was letting on. And there were a couple of reasons for this, a couple of reasons why they weren't totally happy with Stephen Grant and his story. Number one, they could tell very early on that he was incredibly nervous. But when taking his statement and asking him questions, they could just tell from how he was answering that he clearly felt very, very anxious and on edge. Of course, that could very well have been because he was very nervous about whatever had happened to his wife. But also the police wondered if he was very nervous because maybe he had something to hide. In addition to that, another thing that added to the suspicion was the fact that Stephen Grant went from being extremely cooperative one minute, in fact a little too cooperative one minute, to very, very uncooperative the next. So like right in the beginning of this case, he was trying to be as helpful as possible, answering any and all questions. To be honest, he was almost trying to insert himself into the investigation a little too much. But eventually eventually this changed. He stopped cooperating with the police. He actually got himself a lawyer, and when the detectives asked if he would be willing to do a polygraph test, a lie detector test, he said no. Well, he refused to do one with the police. He agreed to do a private polygraph test with his lawyer, and the police would eventually go on to learn that the results of this test were inconclusive. They couldn't tell if he was being truthful or deceptive. I also read on one source that whilst at first in Stephen's TV appeals and TV interviews, he seemed very intent on, making the focus of the news segment about finding Tara and appealing for information. As time went on, people began noticing that he would start to kind of talk about his missing wife and the mother of his kids in a rather negative way. Apparently he started making comments about how she worked away too much and how hard that was for the family. They noticed that he started making comments about infidelity, hinting that Tara had been unfaithful during their marriage, which we'll come back to in a second. But yeah, it just seemed very, very strange. He was reaching out to all of these news outlets, asking to do televised appeals to spread awareness of his wife's disappearance, and then he just started painting her in a negative light. It just seemed very odd. But the number one red flag for the detectives, the thing that made them the most skeptical and suspicious of Stephen Grant, was the fact that they discovered that there had been infidelity in the Grants' marriage. But this infidelity came from Stephen. About a week into the investigation, the detectives were contacted by a member of the public who claimed that he used to date this woman named Dina, and that Dina also used to date the guy that he had been seeing all over the news, Stephen Grant, the husband of missing Tara Grant. Dina and Stephen Grant, I believe, were kind of like childhood sweethearts. They knew each other when they were very, very young and had dated previously. However, about 2 weeks before Tara Grant disappeared, they had reconnected. They started speaking again. Well, not just speaking, flirting. I believe the police got in touch with Dina following this tip, I guess, and she claimed that whilst they hadn't had like a full-blown affair, nothing had happened in person between them, she and Stephen had been sending each other flirtatious emails in the weeks leading up to his wife's disappearance. I believe Dina worked as a nurse, and Stephen would make comments in these emails about how he wanted her to give him a sponge bath, and he'd also made comments about how he saw marriage vows as speed limits, occasionally meant to be broken. But whilst Dina claimed that her and Stephen's affair remained strictly online over email, what the police would soon discover was that Stephen Grant's relationship with another woman was much more physical. Police discovered that Stephen had also been cheating on his wife Tara with none other than Verena, the au pair, the live-in nanny that Tara had hired to help Stephen with their 2 children. And just a reminder that Verena was only 19 years old at the time that this case took place. Stephen was almost 20 years her senior. I mean, he could have been old enough to be her father, and yet they were having a secret relationship behind Tara's back. It stated in one article that I came across that Verena had been the Grants' au pair for about 5 months by February of 2007, but that this relationship between her and Stephen didn't start until about 4 to 6 weeks before Tara vanished. Stephen quickly took an interest in Verena after she moved in. He would apparently make inappropriate comments about her, sexual comments. He would flirt with her, and Verena appeared to like this. She enjoyed this attention that she was getting from her boss, I suppose. I mean, she was so young. She was clearly naive and impressionable, and so she would flirt back. She seemed to be just as attracted to Stephen as he was to her. In fact, Verena would later go on to admit that she did fall in love with him. She fell in love with Stephen Grant. But like I said, it was around 6 weeks before Tara vanished when this secret relationship between Stephen and Verena officially began. It became physical. Verena claimed that they had engaged in oral sex in the bed that Stephen shared with his wife Tara whilst Tara was away for work. They would sleep in the same bed and kiss and cuddle whilst Tara was away. And in fact, Verena admitted that one one morning while she was in Stephen's bed, his and Tara's 6-year-old daughter Lindsay walked in, and Verena had to quickly hide under the blanket so that Lindsay wouldn't see her, although I'm not sure if she still did. But even though Stephen himself was cheating on Tara, he became so incredibly angry when he believed that his wife was doing the same. You see, Stephen had had a suspicion for a long time that Tara was having a secret affair with her boss at the Washington Group International. In fact, he even went so far as to install this secret software on her computer which allowed him to look at her internet search history and also read her emails between her and her boss. Now, as far as I'm aware, there was never any evidence or proof that Tara was having an affair with her boss. They have been described as having a very close relationship. They were good friends, but I mean, that's probably because they had worked together for so long. But yeah, Stephen was so paranoid that his wife was cheating on him, and yet he was sending flirty messages and emails to other women and flirting with their au pairs and even spying on them. If you recall from earlier on in the video, I mentioned that Tara and Stephen had hired a couple of different au pairs over the years before Verena came along. Well, what the police discovered when they spoke to the previous au pairs was that whilst they were living with the Grant family, Stephen Grant would secretly watch them. Apparently, he'd cut this hole in the wall or in the closet so that he'd be able to see into the au pairs' bedrooms and watch them get changed, watch them naked. I mean, clearly that was some kind of sick turn on for him. So as all of this evidence was coming to light, of course, suspicion towards Stephen Grant was just building and building, because he seemed to have a clear motive to want to do something to his wife, possibly kill her. He was having an affair with their nanny Verena. Did he decide to kill Tara to get her out of the way? Did he do something to her because he still believed that she was having an affair with her boss and he was angry? As the days passed by and there was still no sign of Tara Grant, the detectives unfortunately became more and more convinced that if they did find her, she wouldn't be alive. They really started to believe that she was most likely dead and had been murdered, because there'd been no activity on her cell phone since her disappearance, no activity on her bank record. She hadn't taken any money out. The police also checked with the airlines to see if she had in fact flown back to Puerto Rico for work, but she hadn't. There was absolutely no trace of her anywhere, no digital footprint whatsoever. So yeah, it was looking more and more likely that this case would go from being a missing persons inquiry to a homicide investigation at some point. 10 days after Tara was reported as missing, on the 24th of February 2007, searches for her began at the Stony Creek Metro Park in Michigan, which was only about a mile away from where the Grant family lived, and it was a huge area, so the police had a lot of ground to cover. They had more than 150 searchers join, they had sniffer dogs, they had a helicopter scouring the area from above, and they were searching for more than 6 hours. However, nothing. They never found anything. But then, just 4 days after this, after the search had ended, something was found in the park, but not by the police, by a member of the public. A woman named Sheila was walking her dog at Stony Creek Park when all of a sudden she spotted what looked like a plastic Ziploc bag which had almost been hidden in this tree stump. And the reason it stood out to her was because she could see what appeared to be blood. There was blood in this little bag, along with some gloves, some hair, and also some tiny metal shavings. Now, Sheila was well aware of the disappearance of Tara Grant, as everyone was in the area at this time. Like we discussed, her case was all over the news, and so thinking that this bag could have possibly been relevant to Tara's case, Sheila immediately contacted the police, who collected this bag and sent it off for testing. And to be honest, the contents of this bag just pointed to Stephen Grant's guilt even more. Now, the hair in this bag wasn't actually Tara or Stephen's. In fact, it wasn't even human human, experts determined that it was dog hair, and the Grant family had a dog that was a very, very similar colour as this hair in the bag. The police were also able to theorise that the metal shavings in the bag had likely come from where Stephen worked part-time at his father's tool and machinery shop. He was constantly getting metal shavings on his clothes and stuff. As for the blood, well, that was later confirmed to have been Tara's. It was Tara Grant's blood in this bag. So now the police were more certain than ever that Tara was in fact dead and that her husband Stephen had killed her. And it was after they obtained this evidence that the detectives were able to get a search warrant for Stephen Grant's home, the house that he shared with his missing wife, and they executed this search warrant on the 2nd of March 2007, about 3 weeks after Tara was last seen. When they arrived at the address, the police presented Stephen with this warrant, and whilst the searches began, he actually took the dog out for a walk. Obviously, he couldn't be in the house when the searches were taking place, and the police couldn't hold him or detain him because they didn't have an arrest warrant. So he was free to do what he wanted, I guess, and he went and walked the dog whilst the search teams made their way inside. Now, as I understand it, the police had had a very, very quick look around the house when Tara was first reported as missing. When Stephen was initially being very cooperative, he let them have a quick look around, and they didn't really find anything or notice anything strange, no signs of a violent struggle or blood. The house appeared pretty normal, but obviously now with the warrant, they could be a lot more thorough, and when they got to searching the garage, they had a breakthrough. Inside of the garage, there were a load of different storage bins, most of which contained very normal stuff like children's toys and food and stuff like that. But then one of the officers got to one of the bins in the garage that apparently just looked quite out of place, and in fact they were sure that it was not previously there when they had first searched the property. This storage bin was new. It had recently been put in the garage, and so the officer opened it up and he saw a load of plastic bags. There was something inside of these plastic bags, plastic bin liners. So he cut open the plastic, and to the police's absolute horror, they found a torso. A fully clothed human female torso. And that was it, just a torso, no other body parts. This person had clearly been dismembered. And of course, the police knew right away who this was. This was the torso of missing Tara Grant. She had been cut up and part of her stored in this bin in her own garage, next to the house where her children were living. But where on earth was the rest of her? The police searched the rest of the garage and the house, and no other body parts were found. So what had Stephen done with the rest of his wife? But also, where the hell was Stephen? Like I said, he went to take the dog out for a walk when the search of his home began, or at least that's what he said he was doing. Well, clearly that was a lie, because he never came back. He obviously panicked when the police turned up with the search warrant because he knew what they were going to find in the garage, and so he just left. Stephen Grant was on the run. So a manhunt operation immediately began to find this murder suspect. Detectives were sending patrol officers out to various different areas and locations to look for him, and in the meantime, other searches also continued for the rest of Tara's body parts. And the detectives did have a theory here. They actually believed that Stephen Grant had initially tried to dispose of his wife's remains at Stony Creek Metro Park, but they believed that he moved them, or some of them moved her torso back to the house when he learned that the police were planning on searching the park 10 days after the missing persons report was made. According to one source, the reason that the police believed this so much was because they noticed that in a number of Stephen's TV appeals that he'd done in the weeks that his wife was missing, he did mention Stony Creek Park a good few times. He would make comments like, "Oh, we love the park. Me and Tara take the kids there. I mountain bike there. It's the reason we moved to the area." He was just making comments about the park all the time. Is that because the park had some relevance to the case, the police wondered? I mean, we know that the bloody Ziploc bag was found there, so what if that's where the rest of Tara's body parts were too, and the police just didn't find them during their first search? I mean, it was a very difficult search the first time around because there was a lot of snowfall, so it makes sense that they might not have been able to spot anything initially. So the day following following the discovery of Tara's torso on the 3rd of March 2007, a second search of Stony Creek Park commenced, and sure enough, their theory was correct. They recovered body parts. They recovered more of Tara Lynn Grant's remains. So whilst the police were recovering these remains, the manhunt for Stephen Grant continued, and 2 days after the police discovered Tara's torso on the 4th of March, he was found. Police were able to track Stephen via a phone call that he had made to his sister. They were able to trace his phone to the Wilderness State Park in northern Michigan, more than 225 miles away from where he lived. Apparently, he'd driven there with the intention of killing himself. He'd written these suicide letters for his children, and I think he left these letters in the car. He'd taken liquor with him and sleeping pills and razor blades and even a fake toy gun, because apparently he hoped that if the police did find him, if he pointed this fake gun at them, maybe they would just shoot him dead themselves and he wouldn't have to take his own life. But that is not what happened. You see, by the time the police found him in the Wilderness State Park, Stephen Grant was in a very, very bad way. He was suffering from extreme hypothermia because it was so cold outside, so he was basically collapsed under this tree. That's how they found him. He was apparently seeing things, seeing people that weren't there. He was talking to the trees. He literally couldn't walk, so he had to be airlifted to the nearest hospital. And after he was treated for his hypothermia, police immediately went to the hospital and they arrested him. They arrested him for the murder of his wife, Tara Lynn Grant. And would you believe it, there was no longer any denial. As we know, up until this point, Stephen Grant had been trying to portray himself as the innocent and distraught husband who was devastated that his wife was missing and who was doing everything that he could to try and find her. But it was all an act, and he finally decided to drop the act following his arrest. I mean, he clearly knew that there was no getting away with this now, and so he confessed. He admitted that, yep, he was the one who killed and dismembered his wife, Tara Lynn Grant, and he gave the police his version of events of the night that Tara died. So Stephen said that on that Friday evening, the evening of the 9th of February 2007, Tara returned home from working in Puerto Rico. She was unpacking her bag in her and Stephen's bedroom, and he was getting undressed, ready to go to bed. And he said that that was when an argument just broke out between them. They were arguing about the fact that Tara had to travel back to Puerto Rico earlier than usual on the Sunday instead of the Monday, and how Stephen felt that she wasn't spending enough time with him and the kids, how she was always busy with work, always busy with her boss. And Stephen claimed that towards the end of this argument, Tara told her husband to, quote, fuck off, and she started trying to walk away from him, but he wouldn't let her. He grabbed Tara by the wrist to pull her back, and so she slapped him across the face, and it was almost like in that moment he just saw red. He hit her back, causing Tara to fall backwards, and as she did so, she banged the back of her head on the floor, but she wasn't knocked out. She was still conscious, and Stephen claimed that that was when she told her husband that she'd had enough. She was divorcing him and she was going to take the kids, and Stephen was going to be out on the streets. He was going to be homeless, and he just snapped. He lost it. He lunged onto Tara as she was still on the floor. He put his hands around her neck and he began to choke the life out of her. And as Tara was gasping for air, staring into her husband's eyes as he had his hands around her throat, he grabbed an item of clothing and he put it over her head, over her face, so that he didn't have to look at her whilst he was killing her. Eventually, Tara went limp. She was lifeless. Stephen had strangled her to death on their bedroom floor whilst their 2 children were sleeping in rooms just across the hall. And he said that after Tara was dead, he just panicked. He decided that he had to try and cover this up. So he grabbed this leather belt and he looped it around Tara's neck, and using it, he began dragging Tara's body along the floor. He dragged her all the way down the stairs, through the house, and outside towards his wife's car. And I think it was then when he got her outside that the belt around her neck snapped and Tara's head literally dropped onto the concrete floor. And Stephen described to the police how the noise that her head made when it dropped onto the concrete was just the most disgusting noise that he had ever heard. He likened it to the sound of a watermelon dropping onto cement. He put his wife's body into the back of Tara's SUV SUV car, and for the time being, he just left her there because just moments after he put her in the trunk, he heard their au pair Verena arrive home. If you remember, she had been out with some friends of hers that evening, and when he saw Verena, he told her the same lie that he later told the police when he reported his wife as missing, that he and Tara had argued that evening and that she had packed a bag, gotten into this dark coloured car and just left, and that he had no idea where she was going. And Verena believed him. I guess she had no reason not to, and she felt so sorry for him. Although it turns out that he did later confess to Verena shortly before Stephen's arrest, I believe whilst he was on the run. He called Verena and he confessed that he had in fact killed Tara, and Verena immediately contacted the police and she told them about this confession. But back to Stephen's movements in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death. So he actually left Tara's body in the trunk of her car for about 2 days. For that entire weekend, she was just left in the car, but obviously Stephen knew that he couldn't leave her in there forever. He had to figure out what he was going to do next. So on the evening of the 11th of February, he got in the car and he drove his wife's body to his father's tool and machinery shop, and it was there where he dismembered her. He laid her out on this tarpaulin sheet and he began cutting her into several different parts with this big bandsaw. He then put each body part into a plastic bag, a plastic bin liner, and put all of these bags into this big storage bin or storage container, and then he put the container back into the car. The following morning, he returned to the car with this sledge that belonged to his children, the sledge that they would use when they were playing in the snow. He put the sledge in the car alongside the container and he headed to the Stony Creek Metro Park. He planned to bury Tara's body parts there, and he was going to use the sledge to make it easier for him to drag the storage container. However, he said that whilst the container was on the sledge, it tipped and started literally sliding down this hill, and he immediately started running after it. He was running after this storage bin containing his wife's dismembered remains, and he wasn't able to catch up to it before it tumbled over, the lid came off, and all of these bags containing each body part fell out all over the place. Like I said, he initially planned to bury each body part, but I think he just started panicking so much when they all fell out that he started just picking each part up and throwing them around. I think he tried to bury some of them under the snow. He buried the bin containing Tara's torso under the snow, and then he left. In the meantime, whilst he was disposing of Tara's body parts, he was also covering his tracks in other ways. As we know, he was calling Tara's phone, leaving voicemails, asking her to contact him and let him know where she was. And then on the 14th of February, he reported her as missing to the police, and the whole act began. He was portraying himself as this innocent husband who was desperate to find his wife, trying to get on the TV as much as possible so that hopefully people would believe him, believe his story. And like I mentioned earlier, it was later into the investigation when Stephen learned that the police were going to search Stony Creek that he panicked, and he returned to the area and he retrieved the container containing Tara's torso, which he hid in the garage. I think he did plan to retrieve the other body parts too, but I'm guessing he just couldn't find them, and it's believed that he probably hoped that animals would have gotten rid of those for him, you know, would have eaten them and taken them away, and the police would never find them. But of course they did. They did eventually find Tara's remaining body parts at Stony Creek, well, all except 3 of the parts. According to a Crime Watch Daily episode that I watched about this case, Stephen cut Tara's body into 14 separate pieces, and I believe to this day only 11 of these have been found. And alongside the body parts found at Stony Creek, the police also recovered a couple of the bandsaw blades that Stephen had used to dismember his wife. So that was Stephen Grant's account, his version of events. Of course, the police believe that there were probably holes in it, probably aspects that he still wasn't being completely truthful about, like his reason for committing this crime. He claimed that he did it because he and Tara argued about her busy work schedule, and Tara threatened to leave him and take the kids, but the police were skeptical. Was that the real motive here, or did he kill her because he was having an affair with their 19-year-old au pair Verena? Did Tara find out about the affair, and that's what the argument that led to her murder was really about that night? night. Who knows? What the police do know for certain is that Verena had no involvement whatsoever in this homicide. They did consider the possibility that she could have been an accomplice, but she wasn't. As I've said a few times, she was out of the house that night and she had no idea about what Stephen had done to his wife until he confessed in that phone call to her before he was arrested. Following Stephen's confession, he was charged with the murder of his wife, and also he was charged with the disinterment and or mutilation of a dead body. And after his trial in December of 2007, he was convicted. He was convicted of second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 50 to 80 years in prison. So at the very, very earliest, he would not be released until he was around his late 80s, but of course it is highly likely that he will never be let out. He will die behind bars. In the aftermath of Tara's murder, Tara's sister Alicia actually took custody of her children, Lindsay and Ian, who, as we know, were just 6 and 4 when their mother was murdered by their father. They were raised by their aunt Alicia and Alicia's husband Eric, and Lindsay and Ian later took on their aunt and uncle's last name, Standifer. They became Lindsay and Ian Standifer, and according to an article from 2017, 10 years after their mother's murder, the kids are doing really well. Obviously, they aren't really kids anymore. They were both in their teens by 2017. They'd both be adults now. But yeah, they are doing well, and actually they're working really hard alongside other members of Tara's family to raise awareness of domestic abuse and violence. They take part in an event called Tara's Walk every single year, which is an annual event, a 5K walk, I think, where they raise money for domestic abuse charities, I believe, and yeah, it's just amazing to see how they've turned such a tragedy in their lives into something positive, a legacy for their mother, who they lost far too soon. And that is it for this case. That concludes the case of Tara Lynn Grant. A really heartbreaking story. Tara didn't deserve to lose her life, and her children didn't deserve to grow up without their mother. But again, it is incredible to hear about the work that they've been doing in her name to help other victims of domestic violence. I'm sure that their mum would be so proud of them. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box of every single one of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!